One of the things that I found out that was sort of amazing about your history, you briefly mentioned it right before we started, you were a Marxist at one time in your life. Most people will find this hard to believe, but it is true.
But it's not that unusual. Most of the leading conservative thinkers of our time did not start off as conservative. You had a couple like Bill Buckley and George Will. But I mean, Milton Friedman was a liberal and a Keynesian. Hayek was a socialist. Ronald Reagan was so far left, at one point the FBI was following him. You know? So there's a huge movement from the left to the right as people get older.
Yeah, I'm well aware, as I mentioned to you earlier, as a former progressive, I understand that movement in the modern sense. Do you remember sort of what you were thinking, what appealed to you at that time about Marxism?
Yes, I mean, there was no alternative being discussed. My first job was as a Western Union messenger. And I would come home on some nights, I would take the Fifth Avenue bus, which cost all of 15 cents in those days. But I figured I'd splurge now and then. And I would drive, it would go all the way up Fifth Avenue, past all these Lord and Taylor and all these fancy places. And then across 57th Street past Carnegie Hall and down Riverside Drive, and that was sort of the Gold Coast area. And then as I came across this long viaduct, that turned into 135th Street. Suddenly, there were the tenements, and I wondered, why is this? I mean, it's so different, and nothing in the schools or most of the books seem to deal with that, and Marx dealt with that. So it's like winning an election when there's only one person running.
So then, what was your wake up to what was wrong with that line of thinking?
Facts. Well, you know,
we could probably end the interview right there.
Yeah,
Facts. There you go.
And specifically, my first professional job, I was a summer intern at the U.S. Department of Labor, and I realized from dealing with these people that the U.S. Department of Labor, one of my biggest concerns was about minimum wages. It has been for a long time. And so at first I thought, well, this is good because all these people are poor and they'll get a little higher income, and so that'll be helpful. And then as I studied economics, I began to see, well, there's a downside. They may lose their jobs completely, so there's that. And so when I was at the Labor Department, I tried to talk about that to them, and eventually I came up with some test of it. And when I came up with this test, how we might test this, I was waiting to hear congratulations, you see, that I had this. And I could see these people were stunned. They said, oh, this idiot has stumbled on something that will ruin us all.
Wow.
You know? And I realized the U.S. Department of Labor had its own agenda and interests. And that did not necessarily mean that whether poor people lost their jobs for minimum wages or got higher pay was their highest priority.
Yeah. How much longer did you last at the department?
That was really the turning point.
Yeah.
And then I began to see that all these government agencies and whatnot, they have their own institutional incentives. And you cannot say that the government will step in and do what's right for these people and whatnot, because they'll do what's right for themselves.
So I think a lot of people watching this, and I know because I've been so open about my own sort of awakening, are going through this right now. They're realizing that the things that they've been taught for so long are not the truth and are not based in fact. When that happened to you and you started telling other people, not just the people you were working with, be it family or friends, what kind of pushback did you get? Because it was sort of radical ideas in a way that you were talking about then.
Well, I didn't feel any need to do a lot of proselytizing. It was enough for me that I was now beginning to understand things I hadn't understood before. And as you noted in the book, I mentioned minimum wage studies, and really they're incredibly flawed. There's a whole chapter on numbers. And the other thing, getting back to my personal development, I mean, I left home when I was 17, no high school diploma, no skills, no job experience. And I discovered that there was not a huge amount of demand for people like that. But in retrospect, decades later when I do research, I realized that in 1948, the unemployment rate for black 16 and 17-year-olds was 9.4. For whites the same age, it was 10.2. And those numbers are much smaller than we're used to in recent decades. And there's no serious racial difference. In fact, the blacks at my age bracket, we're doing just slightly better. And of course, one of the things that the minimum wage law does is that it creates unemployment, raises it to multiples of what it was. 1948 was a special time because the minimum wage law was passed in 1938. And in the intervening 10 years, there was huge inflation, and the law hadn't gotten changed. And so for all practical purposes, there was no minimum wage law. But had we had these wonderful liberals insisting that I be paid a living wage that would support a family of 4, I would have been unemployed.